Well, as most of the Bay Area has begun recommending masks again, some people are resistant, even as the Delta variant poses a serious threat. But what's behind the resistance? For more on how to manage that, we turn to the KCBS Ring Central Newsline to speak with Dr. Carisa Parrish, Associate Professor at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. There certainly is a bit of confusion, but why is it frustrating once people know why they need to mask up again?
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me. I think a lot of the reason for the frustration is this is a behavior that we don't generally enjoy doing. We thought we were going to be done with it at some point, and now we're back again. It sort of reminds me when I'm working on homework or chores with my kids, and we thought we were at the end, and then we discover something else, and we have to keep slogging along. So it's not a welcome change.
Let's actually take a step backwards and talk about why it is that vaccinated people in particular are being asked to mask up. Is it to protect the unvaccinated, or is it because of the breakthrough cases that we tend to hear about?
Well, as a psychologist, I won't get into all of the medical kind of public health reasons. I think that scientists and physicians are recommending that we mask up again. I think about how we don't know who exactly is vaccinated or not, and there's no requirement for people to disclose that at this point. And so when we're putting on a mask, it sends a social signal as much as it does providing a public health intervention. So I think about my kids who are not yet eligible by age to be vaccinated, and I want to model for them the behavior that I think is safest for them right now. And so even though I'm vaccinated, I often wear my mask in places where it's not required, just to signal this is something we should be doing to protect the safety of our fellow neighbors.
And in terms of people maybe who don't have children and don't have to do that modeling, people who might be resistant or might be frustrated, what's a good way to deal with them? And how do we talk to each other about this without getting into arguments?
Totally. I think one thing that I think about is when people are interacting with me, how am I most persuaded or most remaining most open to hearing a different perspective? And usually it's not through, pointing out, castigating, shaming, kind of like negative emotional guilt tripping that can happen when people have differences of opinion, particularly strongly held differences of opinion, but kindness, patience, and trying to just gently explain what the other perspective is. I don't know that a lot of us were convinced by someone treating us with disrespect or rudeness. And so it's hard to do when it feels like there's a lot at stake. And I definitely agree there's a lot at stake, but taking a breath and trying to just kind of keep that perspective in mind, like what is persuasive to me? And if this is someone that you know well, what is persuasive to them?
Is there something that we can compare this to that we've been through before? I mean, this is such a once-in-a-century experience. Is there anything that you could point people to sort of compare the kind of communication that we'd want to use to?
I know. The public health implications of this individual behavior feels a little bit different, but I think about when I was a kid in the 80s and there were federal legislation, state legislation changes to seatbelt wearing, where generations of people had never worn seatbelts, by mandate, and just getting people into a new behavior, and how it may not be a behavior that affects you, but it could affect someone that rides with you, and the number of traumatic injuries children experience when they're not properly seatbelted or seating in the right position inside the car. So it's not exactly the same public health level that we have with the viral transmission of COVID, but there are some parallels where it's like I'm having to take an extra step for a behavior that I don't normally have to do. Some people don't think they need to do it for all sorts of reasons, right? But at the end of the day, it became a mandate because it was for the safety of the majority of people.
That's kind of
so
like
that helps me. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's kind of like smoking in bars. That was just about 20 years ago or so that became a public health mandate not to do anymore. And now it seems like second nature.
Right, exactly. There was a lot of resistance to that too. And yet here we are.
Oh, yes, I remember that very well. So in terms of whether it's policy or just individual people, in terms of getting through this and getting through this really contentious time, because we've got politics mixed in it as well, beyond sort of treating people with respect, are there any specific tips that you might offer?
Well, I kind of like how we've had different phases of using different strategies across the country. So I think giving people time to adjust to the news that the vaccines are now available, that, week by week and month by month, we have more and more data on the safety and efficacy of the vaccines. But at some point, sort of like when kids go to public school, there will come a time that we have to draw a line and say, for us to maintain the safety of everyone else, we will have to have some guidelines and mandates.
And I just thought of one more question before we let you go. In terms of politics, because politics has gotten mixed up into this, it's gotten mixed up into vaccinations, it's gotten mixed up into the mask wearing. Does that make it more difficult? It would stand to reason that it would. So are there any specific tips related to politics that you're aware of in terms of how we relate to each other?
It almost feels beyond my scope as a psychologist to answer that question. I don't think there's going to be an easy answer other than there's going to take kind of a multiplicity of approaches here to try to reach everyone, because not every strategy is going to work with every person. I go back to the seatbelt issue or helmet wearing. Eventually, if we don't have a mandate and a law for people who are not cooperating with what we think is in the best interest of all, at some point there will have to be a consequence.
All right. Well, we thank you very much for offering your expertise. That is Dr. Carisa Parrish. She is an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine.